Well, let's return to Westminster now and the further unravelling harassment scandal. Joining me now is the blogger from the Conservative Woman, Caroline Farrow, and the editor from the Labour List, Peter Edwards. And thank you both for joining me on Sky News this afternoon. Caroline, if I can start with you, if I may. And we've had the Home Secretary, Anne Barrard, on Sky News today saying that any MP that's been found and proven to be involved in any form of sexual harassment should be sacked. This is the right way to treat MPs and found guilty of sexual harassment, isn't it?
Well, I think when someone has been found guilty of sexual harassment, then yes, of course, they need to have sanctions and penalties taken against them, as indeed anyone in the workplace would. But I think what concerns me at the moment is that we've got a real trial by media going on here. So it seems to be that an accusation made in public is sufficient of somebody's wrongdoing, or is taken as sufficient evidence of somebody's wrongdoing. And now that doesn't serve the cause of justice. It doesn't help either the person who's doing the accusing, nor does it help the accused. We need to make sure that due process is followed. And I think one of the things that really grates in this whole scandal is that, you know, for 40 odd years or more, it's always been well known that this kind of thing has been going on within politics. So in America, you had John F. Kennedy and you had Bill Clinton, who pretty much got away with it. And the media all knew and they conspired. And then in this country, we had years ago, the Prime Minister Lloyd George, about 20 years ago, we had Alan Clark, who wrote his infamous diaries in which he talked about harassing, female members of his staff. And this was televised by I think it was by the BBC, and nobody made any kind of comment about it. And then just recently, we've had John Prescott had a 2 years of boozy-filled affair with his PA, with his secretary, in which her diaries wrote that he'd lifted up her skirt, but in a jokey way. And again, that was dramatised. And, you know, yesterday, it completely took the cake when you had John Prescott lecturing us all from the Daily Mirror, you know, popular tabloid, about how to combat sexual harassment in Westminster. I mean, I thought I had fallen down the rabbit hole here. You know, this has been going on and it has had the collusion of the media for quite some time. And you can compare and contrast what's happened in Westminster, where such a fuss is being made. And of course, it's right where accusations, if somebody has been harassing, we need to learn what acceptable behaviour is. But you compare and contrast what's been happening in Westminster with, say, the Jimmy Savile scandal or the grooming in Rochdale and around the country, where, you know, victims were completely ignored. So, you know, I think we need to get a sense of proportion and perspective into this. And we also need to recognise that sometimes somebody making a stupid and unwelcome pass is not necessarily the same thing as nasty and prolonged harassment, such as pressuring a researcher to go out with a contact, for example.
OK, Peter, so many points Caroline's made. I don't even know where to start. Let's start with, I guess, comparing the sexual misbehaviours of the past to today, which is something Caroline brought up. Are we handling this in the right way? And also, actually, are we also over egging? Are we giving too much time to these allegations when we do have more serious, as Caroline is saying, more serious allegations when you look at, say, the Jimmy Savile scandal?
Well, of course, we have to learn the lessons of the past. And I think if Alan Clark was doing today what he was 20 or 30 years ago, there'd again be a public outcry, absolute revulsion. I think as society, we have come forward in some ways that victims, male or female, particularly researchers, are a bit more confident now to come forward. But clearly, we know that perhaps for every case that is reported, there's one or two that haven't been. And I would also question this idea of trial by media that Caroline mentioned. You know, I think someone like Bex Bailey, who came forward with a rape allegation, has been very thoughtful and analytical and intelligent. And she's also making recommendations, for example, about the type of independent body that could be set up so complainants do have somewhere to go where they know their accounts will be dealt with without fear or favour. I think we're in the first week of this, and the media and Westminster itself is still reacting and trying to work out what to make of it all, because we've had Theresa May and Jeremy Corbyn reacting to quite specific individual cases, which, as your intro said, range from inappropriate behaviour to alleged criminality. But like the expenses scandal, which I think this has already exceeded in its horror, then we're going to need a broader set of reforms after dealing with individual cases that look at an independent body for researchers in Westminster to go to, and a way to ensure that trust is restored among the public, who just must be aghast at everything we've heard over the last week.
I mean, Caroline, in terms of that trial by media that you mentioned earlier, and indeed I guess you could also say in this climate trial by social media, you could argue that other voices might not have come out, other voices might not have been heard if they weren't encouraged by some voices making these allegations. You can argue, particularly when it comes to sexual harassment and sexual assault, very difficult to prove. You could argue that these voices coming out and just even saying that investigations should begin, there is a role for that.
Yeah, I think if somebody has been upset in the past by certain behaviour, and certainly can in some ways maybe back it up, then of course they need to come forward. But what I'm very concerned about in particular, well, there's two things. I think the Conservative Party's handling of Charlie Elphicke has been particularly disgraceful. So, they tipped off the media and they suspended him and they reported him to the police without actually telling him what he'd done. Now, that's an appalling way to treat anybody. That's a massive mishandling of the case and a miscarriage of justice, really. And I would also say, with Damien Green, again, this is abhorrent. And this makes life harder for the victims out there. So Damien Green, he's denying it. We need to stress this. But Damien Green is supposed to have had a pornography on his computer now at work. Now, don't get me wrong. I've got no truck with pornography. I think it's corrosive. I think it damages relationships. But at the same time, what he was looking at was, by all accounts, completely legal. We don't know if he was looking at it maybe late at night when there was no one around. That's if it was there whatsoever. He completely denies it. And thirdly, and this is the most disturbing, that the police or police sources have thought fit to leak this to the paper, to leak details of a confidential investigation which happened 8 years ago. You just think, what kind of revenge is going on here? And this does not serve the best interests of justice, as I keep saying, or of the police in this country. How can we trust the police if they're going to leak things to the press? And therefore, I just think we have to be very, very careful. Particularly, I want to see, if somebody has raped somebody or sexually assaulted somebody, I want to see that person locked up. I want to see that person face criminal penalties. But by kind of leaking it out on social media instead of going through the proper channels, there is a much lesser chance of that happening, because the person can claim, rightly so, that they are not going to get a fair trial, that the trial will be prejudiced against them. So, and I also think with some of the Tory politicians, there's this allegation from Andrea Leadsom now that there is a bit of bandwagon jumping on, and there's a little bit of political opportunism, and that's particularly nasty as well. Frankly, if you're in a position of power and somebody has sexually harassed you, you don't sit on that. You don't sit on that for 6 years. You should report it straight away. And I think if that's something that can come out of this, along with acceptable standards of behaviour, i.e., male politicians, particularly if you're married, keep your wandering hands to yourself, then that can only be a really good thing.
Caroline, it's interesting that you say that these allegations should be reported straight away. Andrew Bridgen said that actually he reported allegations of 3 women approached him saying that they had been sexually harassed by a colleague of his. He reported that 2010, 7 years ago, and nothing happened. And so, but Peter, I'll just put this to you. What are your thoughts in terms of the way that these allegations have been handled? Caroline saying that actually, particularly with the likes of Charlie Elphicke, hasn't been handled very well at all.
Well, in some cases, it's too early to say. I thought there were 1 or 2 red herrings in what Caroline was saying. I think, first of all, in the Charlie Elphicke case, we're not living in a Kafkaesque state. If the Tory whips haven't told Charlie Elphicke what the allegation is, just ask the police. If I was being investigated, I wouldn't kind of hang around on social media. I would go to the police and say, tell me what you know. I don't think they can keep it a secret. There's this thing called disclosure. Secondly, in terms of the time taken to make allegations, well, I think each case is very different. I'd be very wary of criticising the complainants or perhaps appearing to, if someone's suffered sexual harassment or worse many years ago, and for whatever reason their complaint hasn't come to light with the police, either because they raised it internally or because the sense of distress was just so overwhelming, well, that's a matter for them. The reason why, we have a great long statute of limitations and we do investigate historic crimes is because victims should always have a right to highlight what's happened, even if it's years after the event. So I'm slightly baffled by some of Caroline's analysis, but perhaps to concentrate on something we would all agree on, and as Amber Rudd said today, I think this scandal should lead to some MPs resigning, not just from government, but from Parliament if they're found guilty. Because I think, if you're making inappropriate comments, you can't be an MP. If you're groping people, especially young women who might work for you, you certainly can't be an MP. So I hope it is going to take months to kind of clean through, but I hope at the end of it all we do end up with a slightly cleaner bunch of MPs and the rogues removed, because
okay. I do apologise, Peter Edwards. I have to cut in there. However, Peter Edwards and Caroline Farrow, thank you both so much for joining us on Sky News this afternoon. Apologies for interrupting.